Well, just clearing out some folders, and I mentioned this particular individual in a part of a series like on New York. This is Claude Fayette Bragdon. Now, he's very important, very influential architect as well as illustrator and designer. A famous quote of his: mathematics is a handwriting on the human consciousness of the very spirit of life itself, and I would agree to that in a lot of respects. But here are some of his illustrations, and for instance, Sinbad on the roof of a megapolis views a cities of frozen fountains. Another famous saying is that geometry is music frozen in time, and that's because Claude Bragdon was essentially a hermeticist or a esoterician. He's another Sinbad in the desert discovers the five platonic solids. And we start to get a bit of an idea of what he was into. Here's another one of his illustrations, and here he shows, for instance, all these cubes, how they project essentially shadows of the cube at different angles, would project there onto the ground, because he was very much into dimensions, and especially the fourth dimension, and we'll get into that soon enough. Some of his other illustrations, Corinthian capitals and Corinthian design, so it's not just the capital, it's also the balustrades and these other features, including the rosettes as well. Corinthian's very important. We'll talk about that in a moment. Here's another one showing the Corinthian capitals from the from the Pantheon in Rome. If you're not familiar with the Pantheon, I highly recommend you have a look into it and look into the achievements of Greco-Roman architecture, because again, this sort of theme that just keeps running, lost ancient high technology, it's absolute bullshit, pardon the French, because we have to discuss all of ancient technology, not just focus on one or two bits and pieces and look around. Anyone who's who's serious in the topic would have a broader range of study, and well, if you're not including the recorded periods of essentially the argument of lost high technology is that the ancient peoples had some super high technology, yet the Greco-Romans, we know what they had, and they were able to achieve the same without this lost ancient high technology. And again, please study this, and again, you hear the most ridiculous things in surrounding this lost high technology fluff, and that's what it is. It's absolute fluff. It's not based in any sort of reality. It's entirely selective. Essentially, it's a religion, but I digress. Another one of Bragdon's drawings, and here he's showing a comparison of the church here in Rouen and the Candaria temple in India, which I've gone into because in weights and measures, both of these temples resonate with the Hermetic code, this ancient not lost, ancient system of knowledge to separate that from ancient high technology. Knowledge can be achieved with very simple tools, so can architecture and beautiful construction. This really isn't in any doubt, because the same argument, okay, you can't fit a credit card between the stonework of lost ancient high technology. Well, you can't fit a credit card between the stonework of these Indian temples, these later the great cathedrals, or the stone masonry, for instance, in the major art historic buildings here in Sydney. You can't fit a needle or a credit card in them as well. But again, that's just something else. But what's important about this is that it's the temple of man, or that man is the archetype of a sacred edifice. And so whether it's in the Christian or the Hindu tradition, or even earlier Karnak and Luxor, what we find is a similar theme. And this is not Bragdon, but it just shows an example, because especially if you look up John James, he's done some wonderful research on Chartres Cathedral, and speaking and how the chakras, which is would essentially be Eastern, is built into these of the great cathedrals of Western Europe as well, which were only separated by a couple of centuries. Some of them even overlap and are contemporary with each other. But the temple of man, or the archetype of man, is the basis of temple design. Some of this is Claude Bragdon's illustrations. Another one of his, because again he was an illustrator, designer, as well as an architect. But he was also a Theosophist, and so, for instance, he wrote the foreword for Ouspensky's book Tertium Organum. Now, I'm going to put the link in the description to the PDF. So this book you can get as a free PDF as well. But Bragdon was famously a Theosophist, and it's interesting to note that even though he was publicly, unashamedly a Theosophist, it didn't really affect his business. He was still a very important, very sought after architect. And okay, let's get now this symbol here is an ancient symbol. It's actually reversed to the Adolf Hitler's symbol, but this swastika here in the Theosophist has absolutely nothing to do with Nazism. It predates it. And again, that's just, it's just unfortunate that this ancient universal symbol has been tarnished by a particular group as well, but that's something else. Now, Helena Blavatsky, she was famous. She's often maligned as well, I would say. I think that's got to do a lot with a misunderstanding of what theosophy was. Now, she was one of the founders of, let's call it, modern theosophy, but theosophy goes back to around about the time of Drake, John Dee, Edmund Gunter, Elizabeth I, and that period. And it's very much in the same vein as Rosicrucians and the other older esoteric groups as well. Again, just unfortunately, anything which is vaguely esoteric is just is demonized as satanic or whatever. Again, I would say that this again is a just a falsehood. Essentially, it's based on some hysterics, I would say. And again, that's something else. Here's a picture of Blavatsky and some of her fellows in the youth. Now, in Sydney, the magazine, the Path magazine, again, produced before World War II, 1925. There was no Nazi party. There was nothing like that at the time. Again, we see those symbols. And Hunter Street, Sydney. Now, Claude Bragdon wrote for this magazine. He was a influential character. Also in Sydney, we see the Blavatsky Lodge office and the Adyar Lending Library just around the corner from St Andrews. That's not the only. So on Goulburn Street, we also have the Theosophy Society of Australia. It's again, there's some books and a bookshop and stuff in there. And again, we see these same symbols. This symbol for God, essentially, the swastika, and the I know the pronunciation always, but the snake eating its tail. The Star of David, which again is very ancient and predates the Israeli flag or the modern dating of the origin of Judaism. This is a basic construction of sacred geometry, compass and straight edge. And also we see a bit of a variation of the Ankh in there. But very influential, especially in the early 20th century, so the early 1900s, a Theosophical Society. This is in Melbourne, the second major city of Australia. But across the road from the Adyar Library, or is it just one street over? But anyway, what we have is the Anthroposophical Society, which this is Rudolf Steiner House. There's a bookshop in there. Now, this society was a break off from the Theosophy Society, and Rudolf Steiner, most famous for Rudolf Steiner schools, and this type of stuff. Now, interesting. Now, he's one of the few people who's written on the acanthus plant in any sort of detail. Now, if we go back and to the Corinthian capitals, these are acanthus. That's acanthus, 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 acanthus. Also, these Corinthian capitals from the Pantheon in Rome. So, whenever you see this type of column, what is there depicting is acanthus, and it's just, if you do look up, I'll try to remember to put the link in the description, but Rudolf Steiner is one of the few who have written on this in any detail, and eventually I'll get around to talking about the secrets of acanthus because, well, it's hidden in plain sight, as they say. It actually goes back to the Yugas and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I will get to that eventually. But another interesting figure, a very important figure, and a theosophist was Nicholas Roerich, an artist, very influential artist. The Roerich Pact, which was his international agreement on the preservation of ancient sites, ancient relics, and this type of stuff, was named after Nicholas Roerich. He pushed forward this particular movement. Now, I'll put the link in the description because the Ghostbusters movie itself, some very interesting links there, and you can connect it directly to Roerich. He's not by name. They've changed his name and they've fused a few details together, but Nicholas Roerich essentially is the basis of the spooky part of the Ghostbusters story. So if you've heard of Riddle of the Sphinx or Oedipus, Well, Oedipus was on his travels. There was a sphinx which would ask travelers a question. If they didn't succeed, if they didn't answer the riddle, they would be killed. Oedipus, famous for the Oedipal complex and of a son loving the mother. But again, if you read the actual story of it, it's not as it's still creepy, but it's not the creepy son loving mother story that most people would connect it to. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. But this is a depiction, one of Roerich's pictures, and what we have is, well, okay, let's go back for a moment. So Oedipus was able to answer the Sphinx, and he killed the Sphinx, and basically, and by killing, because he answered the riddle, the Sphinx died, and then the road was open for so free travel was allowed after. But the Sphinx asked the riddle: what walks on two legs? What walks on four legs, then two legs, then three legs? So four legs, two legs, three legs. Well, that's here. This is the three-dimensional. Well, this is actually the Oedipal question, because what walks on four legs? A baby. What walks on two legs? A man. What walks on three legs? An old man with a cane. This was the riddle. This was the answer to the riddle of the Sphinx. Another picture of Oedipus and the Sphinx, and this is again by Bragdun. Very interesting. I'll put some links to his works, A Primer of Higher Space, and the Uspensky book as well. But what's interesting here is, so we have I'm missing the top line, but four-dimensional vision of ordinary human sight. Now, throughout Bragdun's works, he's talking about the first, second, third, and the fourth dimension. He's very, very much into the fourth dimension. And I will put a link in the Primer of Higher Space, the fourth dimension, Man the Square, a higher space parable. Now you see, okay, let's shrink that down. So this is another famous quote by Kepler, but it's included in Bragdun's work. It's essentially talking on the same topic. But this is another picture from the Primer of Higher Space, and what we see is him is depicting one form of the hypercube or the tesseract. And he's also done, like for instance, we see a two-dimensional square, a three-dimensional cube, and the hypercube, the tesseract, or the four-dimensional cube. This is one of the depictions of this cube. Now, I'll put the links in the description, but where is the... Okay, from his book, here are some of the plates from his book. And again, it's all essentially the tesseract. It's another depiction of a variation of it, like the hypercube. And so again, these links will be in the description. Some very interesting reading, variation, like unfolding the hypercube and the fourth dimension and that type of stuff. Now, I'm going to also put, so there'll be a Ghostbusters link and Nicholas Roerich in the description. But I'm going to also put a video which I'm talking about the harmonic numbers and how they're actually connected through the fourth dimension as well. And yeah, so just some crossover, like especially when I found out about Bragdun, thanks to Neil S. for connecting me to there, because he lives in Rochester, and in Rochester, New York is where most of Bragdun's writings are stored. And these are just some pictures from Rochester, courtesy of Neil S. Again, you will notice the zodiac, hoot hoot, here's the owl, connecting with Athena. We also have the Meloria Madams, as they're called, with these 9 sculptures. Athena in the library there. Okay, there's some of the surviving of the 9 Meloria Madams. So the 9 will give you a bit of a hint as well. This is a statue of Athena. You might notice these depictions here. Originally, this was meant to show a picture of, because this was Kodak. Rochester was almost like the early Silicon Valley Kodak, and that was centered in there. It was a place of high technology and innovation. But okay, so links will be in the description. And yes, so the Tesseract, Claude Bragdon, fourth dimension, platonic solids, links with, he had a bit of a clue what was going on with a canvas. And there is one of the big secrets that, again, I've promised I'll get to it eventually, but a canvas, pay attention to that. You can look up Rudolf Steiner and his writings on a canvas. That's pretty cool, but I've got some mind-blowing stuff in regards to that as well, how it connects all these ancient cultures through the what's called the elixir of life, but that's something else.